Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Teaming Up with the Hodges Partnership. Today, you have me, Tony Scida, and I'm joined with the co-founder of the Hodges Partnership, John Newman, and we're going to talk about podcasting.
That sounds like so monumental, the co-founder. Gosh. Okay. All right. Let's keep going. Sorry about that. I just needed to interject that there.
So one of the things that we find a lot, John, and you can weigh in this as somebody who deals with a lot of our new business, is that a lot of companies are thinking about podcasting and how it might be a fit for them, whether that's making their own podcasts, internal or external, or getting involved in being on other people's podcasts. And it seemed to make sense for you and I to talk. I've been listening to podcasts basically ever since they were a thing, and I know you like to listen to podcasts too, and also you host a podcast, which we'll get into in a little bit. But I thought that we would discuss today a couple of our perspective as to what companies should be thinking about when they're thinking about podcasting.
So it's interesting. Whenever there's like a new tactic, it's almost like a new toy, and everybody's got to have one. It's almost like when like Cabbage Patch Kids came out and everybody had to run to Toys R Us. Remember Toys R Us? Everybody had to run to Toys R Us and get one and play with it with not really knowing what they were, how much they cost, how much went into them, the caring, watering, and feeding of the Cabbage Patch Kid. You had to name it, all that kind of stuff. And it's very similar here. Podcasting, because of the proliferation of things like Spotify and the ability to get podcast easy on your Apple device or your Android device, and everybody listens to them. Everybody wants one without really thinking of all the things that need to go into a podcast, how often, your point of view, who's going to host, what is the topic going to be, how are you going to promote them, all those things that you're like, oh, I'll do a podcast, and then you're like, oh, I've got to do a podcast. So I think going through that and really thinking through what you want, it's like any other communications tactic. What do you want to achieve? Who your audience is? How much time, money, and effort you want to put into it is really important. And then similarly, on the other side of it, if you want to be on a podcast and an established one, it's very similar to our approach to any other media relations, trying to figure out who their audiences are, who they get, how difficult it is to actually pitch yourself to be on the podcast, and then what is your point of view? What do you want to say? Just like being on any other television interview or radio interview or being in a panel discussion or speaking opportunity, you need to think those things out before you decide you want to be a guest somewhere.
Yeah, I think you brought up a lot of good points, and one of the ones I'd love to touch on first is the sort of high amount of labor involved in starting up and having your own podcast. I think one of the things that we find is that it sounds like a really good and fun idea and everybody's into it. And then when you get going, there's a lot of decisions to make, there's investments to make, and then there's a lot of time commitment. And I think I also see sometimes people overlook maybe what's involved on the back end, the editing of it as well, but also the kind of the producing, the planning of it. And especially if you're going to have guests, scheduling, and all of that kind of stuff. So I wondered if you had a perspective on what companies can do to handle that amount of labor or to reduce that amount of labor if they're sure they're ready to get into podcasting.
So, and you brought up this before, I've been co-hosting a podcast, one of my passions, which is Rutgers athletics, which is why I'm wearing the t-shirt today, for almost 4 years now. And, my co-host and I was like, yeah, let's do a podcast. It'll be fun. And it was at that time where, to your point, you've been listening to podcasts much longer than mainstream, but for most of us, it was just turning into the cool thing. Or like, oh, let's be we'll do that. but there was a lot that went into it. And I have a blog post that I put up recently to go along with this episode that really boils it down to sort of the four P's. And those are planning, preparation, production, and promotion. And on the planning side, you need to really think about things like who your audience is, what your topic is, what do you want to do a podcast for? And then how often, how many episodes, and how often are you going to do it? And is it going to be just you and a couple of other folks talking about a whole bunch of stuff? Or like we do, we have a very finite type of format, and we decided at the very beginning it was going to be guest driven. So that lays into what you just talked about, which is okay, you got to find the guests, you have to schedule the guests. It's like any other project that you're going to do that involves other people. You have to schedule, you have to prepare for interviews, all those types of things go into it on the very front end. That's not including all the things like the actual sound and formatting of the podcast. If you need to acquire music, if you need a title, in order to post your podcast on the podcast platforms, you need artwork to go with it. All those things, even before you get into things like syndicating it on all those platforms, you have to think through all those things before you even think about getting going, because that provides the framework for what your podcast is going to be and what you want it to be moving forward.
Yeah, and you and I were talking the other day and drawing parallels between the earlier stages of corporate blogging and the push for podcasting, and how many parallels there are to, you know, the division of labor, who's going to do what, who contributes to it, how are you going to make it sustainable. Either way, whether it's a regularly updated blog, or if it's a podcast, or any other kind of content that you're publishing, you're becoming, a publisher, but you're kind of becoming a news outlet almost. And I think it's important to identify who is going to do that work and make sure that it is part of their job and not just something that gets done off the side of their desk, because then it's going to get pushed by business crucial things. And I think for most companies, they probably have a team, whether that's an internal team in their communications or marketing department, or they have, a PR firm like Hodges, or an ad firm, or somebody else like that. And having a plan for who's going to do what and how they're going to do it is important. And I think an important part of that is involving those people kind of early on in the process so that they can contribute ideas and energy to the process.
Yeah, I think, and we sort of approach it in our conversations that we've had in a couple of different ways. You can have a podcast that is almost like a blog, where it's going to be ongoing for a undetermined long period of time. And in the case of our podcast, we do an average of 2 episodes a month, but it's every other week. And we're never going to end it until we end it. There are also podcasts, especially whether it's series or serials, like the true crime ones, that are more like, there are seasons, right? You have 10 episodes. It's like watching a series on Netflix, where there are 10 episodes, they crank them out, and then they take a long break, and then maybe 6 months down the road, they do another season. So those are some of the things you have to think about. There are positives and negatives to both. I think for us, we know that regularity is very important in order to build a listenership over time. Obviously, if something is more star-driven, like a television show, the seasons will happen, and then you'll come back next year, especially if it was a really good season, or if there's stars that you're attached to. So there's definitely different schools of thought. I do think on the corporate side, the company side, or organizational side, there probably is room for 3 or 4 people having roles. There's the producer, there are the hosts, there are the promoters, and to throw all that on one person is extremely work intensive. I know with ours, we have 2 co-hosts, and we share the duties in finding the guests. We collaborate on the questions and the research. We collaborate on the promotions. We have an outside producer that handles a lot of what you had mentioned earlier, a lot of the editing, putting it together, posting it, because, we started, we're like, oh, we'll record it, we'll learn how to do it, and we'll edit it together. Well, that editing process, even though you have the miracle of computer editing, is very time consuming. And we very quickly realized it was better, maybe not from a cost standpoint, but from a time standpoint, to pay someone else who knew what he was doing to put all that together. So we record on every other Monday evening. And this gets into a bit of the nitty gritty, but we record separate audio tracks for the hosts and for the guest. And then we drop those audio files into a Dropbox that goes to our editor, and he puts it all together for us. And 2 days later, or sometimes a day later, we have the entire audio file that we can then post to the places we need to post it to.
Yeah, that's great. I listen to a lot of independent podcasts, and I think a lot of them work that same way. And that's different than some of the podcasts you listen to, like a Serial or a Gimlet show, where their editing process, they're talking to a lot of different people. They're putting it together as a story that's highly edited with music, and that's like a whole nother level. But that can be good as well. I know that there's some company podcasts that I've listened to. There's a software development company called Panic that makes Mac software, and they have a podcast, and they edit it more like that. And they have an in-house video person who's the one who's doing that. It's a very similar skill set. So,
Well,
so that works for them.
if you listen, and you and I both listen to the New York Times one, The Daily, and they incorporate interviews with their reporters, but they also spend a lot of time pulling news clips that they layer in to make the storytelling richer. And they do a lot of interviews, audio interviews, that they use to, make the story better. So it really depends on how much time and work and financial, because it does cost money, commitment you have in order to do something the right way. And it also depends on who your audience is. I mean, the folks that you're talking about that are very much B2B, that turns into the opportunity to showcase not only, how cool they are because they're doing a podcast, but some of the services that they're offering for their products. So they look at it like any other, communications investment, that could, if you spend a little bit of money, you have the opportunity to impress people and make money on the back
Yeah, I totally. I also want to touch on, you touched on this a little bit before, but you talked about sort of the audience and the audience growth aspect of it. And as somebody who's has experience starting a podcast from scratch and growing the audience, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about. I think sometimes companies, when they get into a new project, they can put all this work and all this effort into it, and then you put it out in the world, and you kind of watch Google Analytics or whatever analytics you have, and feel a little bit let down by the response to it. And I wonder if you could talk about that kind of slow growth that it takes to build an audience for a podcast.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, and this, you want to make sure that the podcast is available on the countless number of podcast platforms that are available. Our podcast consultant, our editor, does that as part of the service that we hired him to do. So on day one, we were hosted on a hosting platform, and then we were syndicated, on Apple, on Stitcher, on Spotify, and all these different places. So availability, because as you know, not everyone gets their podcast from the same. There's not just one podcast repository. You have to be available in many places. We also created social channels for the podcast. We also were known within that Rutgers community and had our own social channels already established. So that helps out as well. And then we created a very simple website that we have posted all 92 episodes on with a podcast player on them. So we're able to drive people during the week that we drop an episode. Usually, like I said, we record on Monday. Right afterwards on Monday, we're promoting that episode on Twitter because that's where we have the most followers. but there are also Rutgers fan groups and also fan websites that during the week leading up to Thursday morning when the podcast drops, we're promoting about the podcast. We'll go in, we'll do Facebook posts, we'll do LinkedIn, we have an Instagram channel, we'll post on those fan boards so that by Thursday morning, our core audience knows who the guests are, what the topics are, and we provide links to the website. And then when the post goes live, not only is it available on all of those platforms, but we can drive people to the website and we have a separate URL just for that episode. So there's a lot of work that goes into promoting that. And over time, especially since it's guest driven, we know, for example, that if we have a football related guest, we're going to get more downloads than any other sport. That doesn't mean we don't focus on other things, but we'll know that going in. And over time, if you're consistent and you build up other ways to communicate, we will communicate to that fan base on those channels during the week and interact with them so that we become, a niche media source for that group. Similarly, companies and organizations have that opportunity to do that with their fans, with their customers, with their constituencies, and anybody else who's interested in the topic that they're talking about in the podcast. So the more you invest in time in creating a community, just like any other communications, the more successful, the more traffic you'll drive to the podcast, at least for sampling. And over time, people, it's like anything else. If they like your product, they're going to come back. If they don't, they're going to find it somewhere else.
Absolutely. I think one of the things I want to touch on, I guess, lastly, is we're kind of running out of time here, is, depending on how somebody is consuming this is a podcast, right? So I wanted to talk a little bit about the genesis of this and how we applied some of these same principles to this podcast you're listening to or video that you're watching. And so I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about where the idea for this series came from.
We have been talking about doing, and we've had other sort of iterations of podcasts in the past. A couple of our folks did their own. We started one, and I think we always like to try stuff out on ourselves before we offer it up to clients. And there's been this push to diversify content, not only from an audio standpoint, but from a video standpoint. So it actually started as a video series. And then we said, wait a second, we could, cross-populate it as a podcast as well, because not everybody will want to watch 20 minutes worth of video, but they'll listen to 20 minutes in their car or when they're out for a walk or a run. And we also wanted to just not make it the same two people all the time. We have a lot of friends that get involved, and it's just the same two people. We also have a lot of very talented people in our organization that do a lot of the work, are experts in their own different disciplines, and thought it would be a great idea to feature everybody. And it's been a lot of fun. It also allows for folks who aren't really used to, I have a long, you have a long history of performing. I, have been in television and radio for 30 years. Being in front of a microphone isn't scary to me. It's scary to some folks. And we wanted to give folks an opportunity to practice a little bit and show off that side of themselves and prove to themselves that what they have to say is really worth it. And it's been a great experience for a lot of folks. People have had a lot of fun, and we've gotten our listenership up a little bit and try to be as consistent as possible. So that sort of was the reason behind it. And obviously it's another way for us to communicate things that we've been doing on our blog or we've communicated to clients. So it's just another fun way to get some of our expertise out there in just a very unique sort of 2021 and during a pandemic kind of way.
Absolutely. And I think people have had fun doing it. I know, even working with everybody all along the way, I learned stuff from every episode. even having heard, I thought all of Josh's old media relations stories. That episode with Josh and Hannah, where they talked about media relations then and now, was really great. And we've had episodes on TikTok. We've had a bunch of different episodes, and where those came from was discussions around the office, discussions in the office Slack, blog posts that people have written, or blog post ideas that people had that they were gonna write, that we thought, that really seems like it could be a good discussion to share. And I think it's been a really interesting process, and I think it's let people flex different sides of their skill set, than that they've gotten to use before. Obviously, I've enjoyed putting the actual videos and podcasts together and making the artwork, and I even wrote the little tune you heard at the beginning. So I know that that's been fun for me. But if you don't have the folks in your office that can do all those little parts, well, first of all, they might surprise you. But if you don't have the people that can, there's stock music sites, there's um, templates for creating the promotional video versions of the episode to share on social media. So there's a lot of tools out there to help people put this stuff together.
I was going to say, and we started ours 4 years ago, and since then, I know you've found easy ways to get podcasts syndicated and uploaded into those feeds. At that time, it was a lot harder, and now there are third-party companies that make it pretty easy for folks.
Yeah, it definitely depends on what size podcast you're going to have as well, right? Something with a large interest base like college athletics, or even athletics for a particular college, you sort of have to be positioned for growth. Whereas, we get sort of the benefit of starting small,
Well, the other thing too, and we haven't really touched on this, was there is a little bit of investment even in equipment, right? Like I went
Right.
out, and it's pretty easy right now. Although when it was hot, it was hard to find relatively inexpensive, good microphones on Amazon. People were buying them up in a crazy way. Now it's pretty easy for less than $100. You can get a good quality microphone. If you're doing a video, a lot of people are like we're doing, combining the two, or broadcasting on video platforms like Twitch. There, for less than $100, you can get a good fill light so that you're not sitting there in the dark. So the costs have come down on all of that, and it's smart to invest a little bit. One of the things that has gotten really good with the advent of Zoom and Teams is, it was harder to get to record on good quality platforms. Those have gotten a lot better as well. So I think for those who want to do it as sort of a fun side project, it takes work. And even, as we were talking about, for brands or for companies, it takes work, but the initial investment is not as much as you would expect. And then if you stay with it, the payoff is going to be very, very good. You're going to have a lot of fun, but you're also going to be able to share that subject matter expertise, which is the goal of doing any of these, especially from a true PR, media relations, corporate relations standpoint.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having this discussion with me today, John. I don't know if you have any closing thoughts, but I wanted to tell everybody to look out for John's blog post on the 4Ps of podcasting, and look for any future news about the additional editions of this podcast itself.
I think my only closing thing is, Tony, I think you get like a 9 out of 10 in Rate My Room. As I'm looking at, you have like the space shuttle behind you, you have some cool equipment behind you. I like the look. It's nice.
Thanks.